Hi there, Sam McGinty, interpreter here at the Frontier Culture Museum, back with another video to talk about Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Crockett's Western Battalion. Now here at the Frontier Culture Museum, we quite commonly get the question of, well, how do you know what you know? Or how do you know that? And that can really be a difficult question to answer, and it's never more difficult than when talking about a battalion that hasn't existed for over 200 years. When it comes to really the documentation and learning about Crockett's Western Battalion, it takes a variety of sources and sort of piecing together things as best we can. When we look at documentation for the battalion, we look at a few different things. First and foremost, we look at any logs, day books, and records of what they were issued and where. Beyond that, we look at the orderly book, which is kept at the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond. That's basically a log that records what the commands and orders by the officers were each day. Beyond that, we can look into various letters between Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Crockett, his officers, and other government officials and entities. And the last thing we look at is pensions, or basically the soldiers who served in the battalion who later on applied to the government for a pension, either land or money, as recompense for their service. And it's never been a more interesting puzzle to put together than in our research into the ambush at Beargrass Creek on September the 2nd, 1781. First time we saw any mention of any sort of ambush or any sort of battle was looking into the papers of George Rogers Clark. Brigadier General George Rogers Clark was the overall commander of Virginia's frontier defense, and his records very specifically state what he had in his various fortifications as far as supplies and how those were issued out. On the 2nd of September 1781, there were some very interesting entries into that log. The first stated, rum issued for the use of artificers who were employed to make coffins for 2 killed officers, signed Joseph Crockett. So it was a very interesting thing to read. We can tell that 2 officers were killed, but beyond that, there's not a whole lot that's being illuminated here, and it left us pretty curious. So we read on. There were 2 other entries, one that stated that rum was to be issued for those who sat in wake for the corpses of the 2 officers, and that cloth was to be issued for bandages for the wounded. So again, we've learned that something happened, but as far as who, when, and why, those things really remained a mystery. Our next real course of action was to go and look at that orderly book, the daily log of all the commands and orders for the battalion. And unfortunately, it seems that someone was remiss in their duties because there was no entry for the 2nd of September, 1781. In fact, there was no entry for that week. So sort of out of luck there. Looking into letters and correspondence, there's no mention of officers being killed, so our last option was to go and look into pension applications. Now, thankfully for us, most of these pension applications were written 20, 30, 40 years after the Revolutionary War by men who had lost their discharge papers and were trying to persuade the government that they indeed did serve in the Revolutionary War and that they indeed did deserve land or money or some combination of the two as recompense. So they often went into very explicit detail as far as where they were, who they were with, and what happened. Looking into these pension applications, we found quite a bit of illuminating information about what happened to those 2 killed officers. The first pension we want to look at is that of Mr. Alexander McClelland.
While in Louisville, Captain Tipton and Captain Chapman of the regulars were killed by the Indians. These officers, when attacked, were right into a station in the neighborhood. They were tomahawked and scalped, and I assisted in burying them. Alexander McClelland.
So from Alexander McClelland, we've learned quite a bit. First and foremost, we learned who those 2 officers were that were killed. It's Captains Tipton and Chapman. That'd be Abraham Tipton and John Chapman, both captains in Crockett's Western Battalion. Further, we learned that they were attacked while riding on horseback to a station or another outpost or fort along the Ohio River, and they were quite brutally tomahawked and scalped, which unfortunately was not an uncommon practice on the frontier. Further, we've learned exactly where this happened. Close to Louisville, which at that point in time was known as the Falls of the Ohio, where George Rogers Clark had built Fort Nelson. And that was Crockett's Western Battalion's base of operations throughout most of the fall of 1781. We can look for further information with the pension application of Joseph Britton.
Upon another occasion, when out upon a scouting party, Captain John Chapman and Abraham Tipton were fired upon by a party of Indians and killed near Beargrass Creek. I was not immediately present at the time, but heard the report of the guns and assisted the burial of said officers. Signed, Joseph Britton.
So we've learned quite a bit from Joseph Britton. First and foremost, he's narrowed down where exactly this incident took place, at the Beargrass Creek, fairly close to Louisville. So now we have an exact location. And in fact, it's not tremendously surprising, as we see a few different incidences, mostly ambushes, happening around the Beargrass Creek throughout really the Revolutionary War. Moreover, he's also told us what exactly the officers were doing when they were attacked. They were on a scouting party, which perhaps is indicative of why they might have been riding ahead and separated from the rest of their men. So Joseph Britton, tremendously useful source for us, gave us quite a bit of information. Now we'll go to Jacob Bush to see what else he might add to our story.
When the news arrived at the falls, about 30 men were ordered to proceed to the place where the officers had been killed in order to destroy the Indians who had committed the outrage. I was one of the men ordered to perform this service. Now this party, with 2 friendly Indians who acted as guides, proceeded to the place where the officers were killed and found their dead bodies. We got on the trail of the Indians who'd committed the act and pursued it to where it crossed the Ohio River, about 5 miles above the falls. The party then gave up the pursuit and went back to the dead bodies and carried them to the falls of the Ohio, where they were buried. Jacob Bush.
While Jacob Bush wasn't a first-hand witness to the ambush, he yet provides us quite a good bit of information. Bush was a scout, and presumably that's why he was picked to help track the men that had ambushed and killed Captains Tipton and Chapman. While he doesn't actually catch them, he shows a pretty good account of what had actually happened in the ambush, that the ambushing Indians simply retreated when they no longer had a numbers advantage, got back in their canoes, went back across the Ohio River into the Ohio Territory, and from there the trail went cold. This is important, though, that it shows that the Western Battalion did attempt to avenge the officers that were killed. The last and perhaps the most illuminating account is going to come from Hugh McGavock, who indeed was present for the ambush. Captain Chapman, Captain Tipton, and I, on a ride to Floyd Station about 6 miles from the falls, were fired upon by a party of Indians. Captain Chapman and Captain Tipton, the one before and the other behind me, were shot down. That my horse, having fortunately turned back on recovering from the fright, instead of forward, where for 80 yards I should have been exposed to their fire. I escaped unhurt, the horses of the officers having followed me to safety. Hugh McGavock. So with Lieutenant Hugh McGavock, we finally have a first-person account of what happened at the Beargrass Creek. He was there for the ambush, and he told his story in his pension in quite good detail. When we talk about this area, it's become clear upon further reading that this was a very good spot for an ambush to take place. It was a clearing of about 80 yards where the trail was in complete open space and the men were completely vulnerable. The 3 officers riding ahead of a scouting party had no idea what was going to happen to them. Hugh McGavock is actually quite fortunate. The officer in front and behind him both get shot, and it just happens to be that his horse reared up and turned so that he ended up getting away scot-free and living to tell the tale. In fact, this was the first of a number of ambushes and skirmishes in the area throughout the fall of 1781 that would really be the brunt of Crockett's actual sort of fighting service in the Revolutionary War. It was tremendously important that they were stationed where they were on Virginia's frontier, what's now Kentucky, protecting a number of farmers, settlers, and settlements from attack from an increasingly hostile group of Ohio Indians that were raiding in the area. And this is really what Crockett's claim to fame could be. When we talk about this ambush, it was a really great instance for us of putting all the pieces together and solving a mystery as far as what happened to these 2 officers and why. And this is something that for us here at the Frontier Culture Museum, we have to do just about every day as historians and interpreters. Finding the answers to these questions can sometimes be like boxing with shadows. It's difficult to find, and sometimes you never really get a good answer. But it's something that we very much enjoy doing here. Hope that you come join us soon, that we can answer more questions about the Western Battalion and some of the other farms here at the museum. Have a good day.